We're recording. I'm going to talk about basically drawing the head. You could call it portraiture. You could call it drawing a face. I think of it as drawing the head because one of the big downfalls of working with portraiture is if you're just thinking of the face and not thinking of the whole head. So notice in these drawings, and these are instructional materials from various books, that it starts with the shape of the head, the shape of the entire head. And look that there's a vertical line and a horizontal line that's drawn around the head. It's not just a straight line. It's thinking about the fact that, much like when we were thinking about volume and other ways in this class, the line follows the shape of the outer part of the outer part of the face and the outer part of the head. We could call these center lines. That's what I would call them. So the vertical center line is going through the nose and, between the eyes and, center of the mouth, etc. It's very helpful to know where the center is because the head could be turned, right? So you want to know exactly where the center is. Even if it's facing forward, you want to know where the center is. And the horizontal center line is basically the eyes. We tend to think of the eyes being higher up on the head, but keep in mind that's because we have a hairline and you're thinking of the face, you're not thinking of the whole head. When you're thinking of the whole head, and I'm not going to bother talking about the skull and all that, when you think about the whole head, the eyes are at about a center between the top of the head and the bottom of the chin. And from there, then thinking about, other lines that would tell you, like, where's the bottom of the nose? Where is the mouth? Where is, and then fleshing it out. So that's part of what we're going to talk about here. And what we're going to be doing today is like, it's really important with the head that you get a sense of the proportions or the space between things. So that's something we're going to want to start with. Here's another diagram that shows kind of the same things, except that it's actually breaking down the head into two parts. Can anybody tell me what are the two parts of the skull? There are only two parts, really, two major parts of the skull. Does anybody know what those are?
Isn't there like the ball on like for the top of the skull and then like the chin cylinder thing at the bottom?
Yes, exactly. So really what we're talking about is, in a skull, we would call the ball part the cranium. That's the round part of your skull. And the part that kind of points down to your chin is what we would call, it's really your jaw, The chin is at the front of the jaw. And the jaw is like technically called the mandible. So there's really those two parts. So it's helpful to think about that rounder part and then think about that more angular part separately. Also notice in these drawings that there's a sense of like where the form is turning, meaning where like the cheekbones come in and are dividing the front of the face from the side. And you can see it in here too. But it's also thinking about center line the same way we were in the first sheet I showed you. These aren't very good reproductions, but it's also showing the exact same thing. And just from the beginning, breaking down the head and thinking more about where the center lines are, how the head turns from the side to the front. So, and breaking it down into cranium and mandible. You can see a real difference between the jaw and the skull here. So these are just some general tips about drawing the head. Another thing that I'm going to talk about here is what it says here, hidden angles. Look at the two drawings, well, the one right under there, that when you really look at a face, you can see kind of a cross in it, that the nose becomes kind of triangular. you see, you can kind of imagine this cross of like how the eyes and cross beneath the nose and down under the mouth. There's various ways of thinking about this. The other way is at the bottom here, where you can see the cross being more like at the top, like the top of the nose. I just want you to notice, to try and notice this when you look at faces or when you are thinking about drawing somebody. And this is also talking about hidden circles. You can certainly impose circles to think about how the features flow together, or particularly in a fleshier face. So, you know, the X's or the more triangular angles may apply more to skinnier or angular or bonier heads, and the circles may apply more to fleshier heads. Both are compatible with each other, though. You know, I can still see kind of crosses in the middle head there, but they round out a little more. This is actually a drawing I did a few years ago of breaking down my own head and looking for those kinds of crosses and looking for these sort of straight line relationships. It's not something we have time to get deeply into today. I just want to point out that it's present. You can see it, like in the drawing on the left. You can see how above the lip and the chin and the nose, they all kind of like cross, you know, like somewhere between the eyes. And that it's happening, you know, throughout the head. And even when the head's turned, you start to see things crossing and overlapping. And we do a lot of drawings like this, you know, usually at Pratt, we have more time. It's a longer course, so we have time to get into the head. And you can, one way of drawing the head is to think about straight lines and crossing. And this is drawn exactly the way I'm talking about, you know, finding center line, finding eyes, finding nose, building out from there, looking for crosses, etc. But what we're going to do today is think about just structuring the head and then thinking about where it breaks itself into shadow. You know, so we did the project earlier in the semester with bottles, where you were thinking about the dividing line between light and shadow. That is especially helpful when you're drawing the head, so that you're not just shading or, you know, creating like gradation, but you're really helping to define exactly what the features and what the form, the structure is doing, when you can be really specific about the shadow. That's why I was asking you to choose some photos that have a really distinct shadow. And look at these, you know, you can see the pencil drawing underneath, and then it's just probably an ink wash that is creating these dark areas of shadow, and it becomes incredibly vivid and volumetric and spatial, and it feels like light when you can do this. So I have a couple of photos. Like I said, I apologize. All I could find was photos of generic, you know, white people as photo models. So that's what I went with, because there just wasn't anything else coming up at all. So before we go to that, I'll just show you a couple of other drawings that really use like comparing. Like if you look at this drawing, there's a lot of comparing where things are. You know, where are you seeing the eyes in relationship to the corner of the mouth? That's why there's, hold on, that's why there's, for instance, lines here. Because you got to make these kind of comparisons. So I'm showing you these things like you got to think about, like, I think there's some lines under there. Like you got to think about, where is the edge of the nose compared to the inside of the eyes? Otherwise, your eyes may be too close together. You got to think about things like, how wide are the eyes compared to the space between the eyes? It's generally about the same, you know, like the eye is going to be about the width of the space between them. And another thing I didn't really talk about, and I'll try and talk about it here just for a minute, is just a general sense of proportion. We talked about the eyes being about a halfway point. It's at about the halfway point between the top of the head and the chin. In this drawing, it's maybe a little bit higher. Bring it down even a little bit here. Then thinking about the nose, you know, the bottom of the nose is going to be about halfway between the eyes and the chin. So if you look at it, oops. See, and I even brought that line up a little bit because I thought it would be too high, but it actually could be a little lower. So yeah, somewhere right here, that's about the middle between the eye, the middle of the eyes and the chin. And you know, where's the middle of the mouth? Somewhere at about the middle between the nose and the between the bottom of the nose and the chin. So I'm going to want you to mark these things off first before you start drawing features. This is really the toughest thing about drawing the head, is you really need to find the relationships between the parts in terms of proportion. And let me just say, there's a tendency for people to always want to just start drawing eyes and drawing a nose and drawing a mouth. And that's not what I'm going to ask you to do here today. So I assume you guys were seeing all these drawings that I'm showing you. Hopefully somebody would have, surely someone would have spoken up if, were you seeing all of them?
Yeah, but can you go back to like the first few pages?
Oh, I could, yes. Hold on.
I was trying to take screen notes and I forgot.
I will share this also. I mean, I'll put this on our Milanote page, the PDF here, but let me just go back since Abar asked. And I'm going to lead you through this, but yeah, this is where we're going to start, is with, you know, thinking about the shape of the head, or maybe a little more like this, somewhere between the two or between these three. And then notice that they're thinking about, like, where's the bottom of the nose? And in this one too, you know, where's the bottom of the nose? So here it's showing like brow, and then it's showing number 3 is like the bottom of the nose. And you can see a line here that seems to show where the mouth is too. I don't know what the numbering system is there. It's beyond me, but virtually every book that deals with the head, with drawing the head or drawing the portrait, will give you a similar kind of information. And yes, animation uses these same kind of techniques, very much so, exactly the same techniques. So I'm going to say that again. Okay, so we're going to start drawing in a minute, but try not to worry too much about it being an exact likeness. That's what we want. We want it to look like the person. We want to get proportions to work particularly, but the main thing is just to be clear about what you're doing. So talked about cranium and mandible. You can see a rounder part of the head here. And the other thing is draw lightly. You know, it's not like a perspective drawing where I'm gonna, like, we want to see all those lines at the end, and like, I do want to be able to see that you're structuring, but you know, you want to have room to change things around. Also notice I'm sketching, you know, I'm trying to find it. So notice that where the cheekbones are, this whole round part kind of comes down into the cheekbones, and that fin extending down is the mandible, which is, you know, a little straighter here, and then it points more like a, you know, like a triangle, points down to the chin here. You know, that can round off a little more later. Also, I would establish the neck. The neck is not unnecessary to the functioning of the head and the whole body. And what these are, and notice that the neck is a little thinner than the jaw. You know, I'd say the jaws are here. Notice the neck's a little thinner, so you got to think about that. You know, think about proportion. Notice also that it doesn't just come in and square off, although you can see what is called the clavicles here, or the collarbone. But leading up to the neck is what we would call the trapezius, which is basically the muscles above your shoulders and back that give you a lot of strength, especially when you're lifting your arms and doing things like that. If you lift an arm up, you can really, you know, you can feel that trapezius working. All right. I'll pause and give you a minute to get there with it. Let me share screen here for a minute and just show this. And I just want to make sure everybody understands that when we're talking about the cranium, we're really talking about, like, I'm going to try and draw this with my mouse, but it's basically like here and coming down like this. So like I said, it also sort of follows, and in some of those instructional sheets I showed you, it sort of tells you where the top of the cheekbones is, you know? So think of it that way. It's not just the forehead like this. It's that whole shape there, because it extends in the back too. Okay, so I wanted to make that clear. Okay, so we want to establish that center line, the vertical center line, which is telling you where the center of the nose is, you know, where the, you know, the transition or the center above the mouth, you know, the whole thing. The face is obviously symmetrical. We also want to then locate the center line that tells us where the eyes are. And I do think in this photograph, it's a little bit above center. So I'm going to go with that. Say, yeah, you know, her eyes are about here. I'm seeing it as about like, yeah, about like here. Where am I seeing the bottom of the nose then? So once you've established that, think about where is the bottom of the nose. If you're drawing this circle, you don't have to go with this, because your circle may not be the right size exactly, but I'm seeing the nose as being about aligned with the bottom of that circle, or a little bit higher. But actually just think of it as, you know, maybe a little higher than a midpoint between the eyes and the mouth. But this is just stuff you have to look at and figure out. And I want to think about where I see the middle of the mouth too. So she's got a really full upper lip, so I want to leave room for that, but I don't want to leave too much room. So, you know, another thing you can do, you know, in drawing, and I've mentioned this before, is measure. You know, you could hold up your pencil and say, okay, and I'm actually doing it looking at the photo. From the middle of the eyes, where do I see the bottom of the nose? And then how far down is it from there? Like, what happens when I go from the bottom of the nose there? And really with her, you know, the bottom of the bottom lip is just a little bit above this spacing. So, you know, the bottom to bottom lip is going to be about here. So anyway, the purpose for marking these things off is to think about proportion so that you're not just winging it and going from, you know, feature to feature. You're actually thinking about like where things are in relationship to each other. And I'll give you a minute to like get there and make sure you're really looking at it. Really look at the image of her and really think about like, how is this working proportionally? Okay, from here, I usually think it's a good idea to start, you know, to think about the nose first because it's central to the face. And, you know, you could think about the general width of the nose. You got to think about it in terms of the whole head though. So don't make it too wide, don't make it too small. I did talk about this kind of crisscrossing thing. This does not have to be done really strongly. I would not do it real strongly because it's very subtle. But you could think about that because some of the features are configuring on this kind of crossing line. I see that. Anyway, there's a couple of different ways to look at the nose. I mean, one thing that I can see is there's kind of a triangulation this way. And look at it and see if you can see that it's basically kind of building outward in a triangular shape, this particular kind of nose. But what I would also think about is establishing the width of the nose and that there's a kind of a column that comes down for the nose. So just something like this, just keeping it relatively simple, but being aware of like the overall triangular shape this way, column of the nose coming out. And I don't want to make it too complicated, but you know, things are complicated. There is a kind of a triangle going this way too. And you know, we don't want to go too far with the nose. So try not to like draw lightly, try not to like set it in stone. And right away, I was also talking before about thinking about where the inside of the eyes are in relationship to the nostrils. So I'm going to think about that right now and draw some lines up from the nose just so I can think about that. And I don't want you to draw a whole eye yet, but just think about like, yeah, how big is that eye going to be in there? Where's it going to be? I'm just going to sort of indicate where the eye is going to be. And keep in mind that you have to leave room to revise your drawing as you go. I mean, my drawing, I'm just, and by leaving room, I mean, don't come down too hard on individual parts. Now, I would also think about, and I'll stop for a minute after I do this. Think about how wide the mouth is. Look at how wide it is compared to the nose. And that really this outside part of the mouth is staying somewhat even with the irises of the eyes. So I mean, there's this kind of crease at the edge of the mouth, and I can see that it's the iris of the eye is the colored part. And I realize you can't even see the eye on that side, but I want you to draw it anyway, you know. Draw it based on this eye, at least indicate where it would be. If I'd noticed that, I might have chosen a different photograph because you can't even see that eye. Okay, and then from here, I'm going to think about, you know, the actual lips are only a little bit fuller than the edge of the nose. And, you know, there's a real roundness here. There's also a bit of like a triangle here. And there's definitely like a real roundness here. So, you know, it's really like breaking it down into shape, straight lines and curved lines. So one thing to be aware of too is I don't even want to really define the head so much with the individual features as I'm going to try and let that shadow really define things more strongly. But some things I do want to find. For instance, I might have already said this, but there's a little bit of like a triangulation thing going on here. And you could see that it kind of leads up to the outside of the eyes. This is, you know, one of those PDF pages I was showing you was talking about this. You know, those crosses kind of come this way too. And that you might even see like, oh, it relates to what's going on at the chin here somewhat. But I also do want, for just the shape of the mouth, to see that her lips kind of come up and do something like this here. It's really subtle. So I don't want to make too much out of it. But trying to get that little bit of that shape there. I also want to think about like what goes on above the lip, like this line here. So this could start me into thinking a little bit about this, the shadow contour. Like what is the shadow actually doing? And if you can be really specific about that, that's going to give you a lot of information that's really helpful. So, you know, where is the shadow that's happening in the upper lip? Where is it divided? And before we go any further either, I want to think about where I see the eyebrow, because the eyebrow has a lot to do with really defining how we read the face. As soon as the eyebrow is there, it's going to seem a little more human. Notice that the eyebrow is a little more straight, and then when it gets to the edge, it curves a little more. It's more straight on the inside and then curved on the outside. And also notice that, you know, I think it's important that you can see a little bit of the top eyelid. You only see it on the outside of the eye. You don't really see it so much on the inside of the eye. I mean, towards the nose, you don't see it as much. You see it more towards the outside of the head. And like I said, I'm still gonna define these things on the shadow side just because it'll give me more of a sense of symmetry, more of a sense of how the whole head is really working. Okay, one thing we don't want to leave off either is where the ears are. So really look at it. Where is the top of the ear? You know, it's about at this center line, maybe a tiny bit below it. And look at the fact that it comes out at an angle too. And you could say it sort of follows like the angle, you know, when I drew this triangular shape here, it's kind of an offshoot of that angle there, but not a big deal finding that, but just don't overdo it. Ear is usually coming somewhere from like around the bottom of the nose, I mean, in terms of proportion, to somewhere around the middle of the eyes. Keep in mind that everybody has different proportions. You know, I mean, there's generalizations that we're making, and those generalizations make sense. But if we all looked at each other, the proportions of each other's heads, everybody's would be a little bit different. You know, one thing is like, as you get older, this space becomes longer. So probably on my face, because I'm a few times older than you guys, the space between the bottom of my nose and my upper lip is considerably longer than most of yours, let's say. And again, I'll give you a minute to catch up, but what I was just doing here when I went back is basically thinking a little more about defining what's going on with the mouth here. I was thinking about defining what's going on above the upper lip. I was thinking about the shape of the brow and the shape of the upper eyelid. So that was a lot. And I was also thinking about the size and general shape of the ear. And you know, ears may seem really complex, but just try and be clear about it. There's the outer part of the kind of edge of the ear, and then you can see this inner part here. That's probably the most important, is getting the relationship between those two. And then there's a little bit of, you can see about a little bit of like the inner part of the inner part of the ear. You know, I probably should be clear about like the same thing's going on with this side. This kind of V shape of the lip. Doesn't only happen on one side. And I think I could also create a little bit of space here in my drawing between the chin. So, you know, in that one, actually, let me just pause. Yeah, there's a couple other things I'm going to look for here. One is that I'm noticing like I can be clear about, you know, there's a tip of the nose that comes down this way, and then really looking at where the nostril is, because the nostril does a lot to define the nose, and that's quite a bit higher than the bottom of the nose. You know, I'm seeing the very bottom of the nose about here, and then I'm seeing the nostril up here. So, you know, you got to take stock of those things. And, that might be a little high, but it's better than it was. Sorry, my eraser is AWOL. Oh, there's one. That little eraser fragments. Okay. So trying to be clear about how the nostril really defines the nose more than a heavy edge out here. I think a lot of you really want to draw a big heavy edge along this side of the nose. You can't even really see this edge of the nose, so you don't have to surround it with a heavy line. And what I also want to start thinking about is like, yeah, what does the shape do of the shadow when it comes across the top of the nose? kind of comes this way. So there's a lot of roundness. Another thing I wanted to mention is because it's in one of the PDFs that you could think about, you don't have to, but just very lightly think about the roundness of the cheeks here. This is what that PDF was talking about, that there's, actually it was talking about more the whole roundness, like here, the eyebrow. This is something I don't usually do in my drawings, so it's one reason it may look awkward in mine, is finding that kind of roundness of the cheek here and here. And certainly there's a roundness of the chin here. But be very subtle about it. Don't overdo it. So I really think you should be getting to a point where, I keep saying leave room so that you can adjust as you go. Like I can see the eye becoming a little fuller here when I'm really looking at her, when I'm really looking at the image there. Her eye is like a little fuller on the bottom than what I had, little things like that. But what we're really getting towards is where we're going to need to use the shadow contour, or what I'm calling the shadow contour, to really define the rest of the form. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. What I am going to do also before I find that, though, is think about the hair also. I see that her cheek could become a little more round here also. On one side. I'm just talking about my drawing. This may not apply to your drawing. I'm seeing that mine could become a little rounded here. So I'm bringing the hair in a little bit. The skull, the head feels a little wider in my drawing than in the photo, and that's because there's room for hair. And her hair is obviously slicked back, so there's really not, it's not coming way down on the forehead or anything. But I just want to think about that. Fine, and actually, rather than bring it up, bring it down a little bit into the rest of this skull, into the forehead a little bit. Looks like it's actually sweeping this way a little bit. Oh yeah, I didn't include my other ear either. Generally, they come in pairs. So and when you're thinking about symmetry, you can always draw a line across. Where's that ear in relationship to the one on the right? And I'm making adjustments as I go. Like I started finding the tip of the nose, but I think it's a little higher. If you really look, it's quite a bit higher than the inside of the nostril. You gotta look at those things, make comparisons, make adjustments. And so I'll take another screenshot and then we're gonna go start going. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna want to do, which I think is probably the most crucial here, is think about, I'm gonna pan out a little bit, what I'm calling the shadow contour, and how that dividing line between light and shadow is really what's doing the most to define the overall form. And, you know, I still want to make adjustments. She looks a little bit, there's something about the shape of the head that looks a little bit male, so I'm trying to figure that out. I think it's the way the hairline cuts in there. Looks more like a guy that's balding a little bit. And those things make a difference. You know, especially, you know, when you're trying to get a likeness. It's a little weird. Like if you can see the difference, just bringing the hair into this little space made it look more like a woman. Whereas when it's receding there, that's a real male thing. Even young males have that going on. Okay, so I already kind of got the shape of the shadow. So this line, I really want to look at where light and shadow divide. And I've already got a bit of that going on here. I'm looking at how it comes down here. I'm even noticing how right at the bottom of the nose, it jogs over a little bit, like defining the inside edge of the nostril as it comes down to the tip of the nose. How far down does this line come? So I want to look at some of those things. Then, you know, that dividing line defines the upper lip here, defines the inside of here a little bit. And then I got to really look at the photo. I also want to think about how it defines this lip here. That's really important. And I think there's even a little bit of cast shadow onto that lip from the top lip. And that shadow comes over this way a little bit. You can see it, you know, like the mouth protrudes and it's casting a little bit of shadow here. So I said from the beginning, this may be the most important part of the drawing, really. All the other parts of the drawing are really trying to sort of set it up so that you can get this dividing line to really work. And as you can see from my drawing, even before I shade it, that really starts to bring it to life in a way that it wasn't before. I mean, it just starts to have more presence. You know, there's also a sense of shadow on the eye here a little bit, like up the lower lid, a little bit above the upper lid. And everything I'm talking about here is specific to this photo, but these are just things that I think you're going to want to think about with any head photo, especially if there's a strong sense of light and shadow, which I want you to look for. You know, I want you to go with photos that have a strong sense of light shadow. If you're using your own photo. I'm noticing that the eyebrow kind of crosses over, but it does not become quite that dark. But I can modify that later. Maybe I'll modify it now. Also, the shadow really does a lot to define the forehead. You know, the brow comes up like this, and then you can really feel the roundness of the forehead or the cranium here. So try and really notice and register those shapes as they occur and how they are really, you know, modifying the shape, modifying the form. And what else? You definitely want to get the shadow under the chin too. So I'm defining it as a line first. There are various ways of doing this, you know. Some people like to shade it in and then erase out some of the whites. There are various ways we could do this, but here's the way we're doing it here, especially because we're using pencil. Okay, so let me focus a little more here. There. And I'm going to take another screenshot of this. But one thing I notice is the upper lip is more defined. I mean, the lower lip is more defined here. So I really want to get that sense of the lower lip and this little sense of shadow in the corner of the lip. You know, sometimes with portraits, the reason you need to do a lot of fine tuning is because, you know, you're always trying to sort of figure out like, what is going to make it look more like this person? Why is it not looking as much like this person as it could? So, and from the beginning, I said the likeness is not the most important thing, especially since this is the first time. But it's still something, you know, the art of it is you want to like be figuring out how to make it more as much like that person as possible. The one thing I'm noticing in my drawing is I made the eyes a little too wide. I want to feel that the eye is a little bit relaxed. You know, she's got a really relaxed, yet potentially fearful look. So I'm going to keep going here. And now I just want to really activate. Oh, well, one shadow I left out, and I think it's important, is where you see light on the cheek here. And it's kind of interesting because it seems to sort of follow this kind of triangular trajectory, the angle that I was already seeing between the lip and the eyes there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm not going to really look for detail in this. I'm just going to be thinking primarily about the difference between light and shadow. And I still want to be really paying attention though, and thinking about like, is that looking right? Do the proportions seem correct? Is it making sense as I go? Because I'm going slowly because I want to be able to look at it and make changes in my drawing if it doesn't seem like the shadow is making sense where it is. Now, the advantage of drawing with charcoal is that you can get a smoother, darker tone. But the disadvantage of charcoal is it's messier and more difficult to get, you know, the other parts of the drawing laid in quite as clearly. So it's kind of a trade-off. That's why we're not drawing with charcoal. And you know, there's a little bit of gradation between light and shadow in some places. that you could bring in. There's some places where the shadow's not as dark, like above the eye, so try and be sensitive to like where the shadow needs to be like really black, where it doesn't need to be. Also notice this, the inside of the eye is actually in shadow. The white of the eye, I mean, is in shadow to the left of the iris here. And the iris goes pretty dark too.
Way more challenging than photography, eh?
Excuse me?
Way more challenging than photography, right?
More challenging? What?
Yeah, more challenging than this. It's challenging than photography. This what we're doing right now.
I would say somewhat, but you know, like with any medium, if you don't know how to work the medium, you know, whether it's pencil, whether it's paintbrush or whatever, Photoshop, Blender, whatever, if you don't, you know, yeah. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
Well, I know what you're saying though, with photography, well, you could put it this way.
Okay, I think I'm getting it.
If this was a photography class, I'm sure there would be a lot to talk about because getting the right exposure, getting the right focus and all that to really get a great photograph like this is not as easy as you might think. But I agree. Pointing a camera at something
Oh shoot.
is inherently not as difficult as, especially drawing a portrait, drawing a head. It's tricky. And once I see the shadow, I notice certain things like, yeah, her chin feels like it needs to be a little fuller here. You could also be aware of what we would call reflected light. Like, there's a little bit of light on this side of her chin and jaw. So I don't want to make the shadow as dark there. Where the shadow resumes there, I want it to be darker against it, like on the neck. So be aware of that kind of thing. And I'm going to pause this so it's not like finish my video. Okay, so I just shaded that in, and it could go further than this. I think the darks could become darker, but conforming to the time we have in class, that's about as far as I need to go. And a lot of it's about troubleshooting and looking for reflected light coming in, for instance, or what parts of the form can I see through this shadow? All that stuff can be really important. And I was just saying off camera, let's say, that, you know, especially when you're finishing something like this, little things can make a big difference. It can be like troubleshooting. What is going to make this feel more like this particular person? You know, and sometimes it's little stuff, you know, just little accents or little edges that make all the difference. Oh yeah, but she has this little marker. Maybe that's gonna make all the